Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert discusses and selects 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, and culture. In the first letter to St. Timothy, St. Paul tells us that God wishes all men to be saved. In the letter to the Romans and Ephesians, on the other hand, Paul explains that God foreknows who will be saved. He predestines them and chooses them. Over the centuries, Christians have struggled to reconcile apparently incompatible and contradictory aspects of salvation. God's foreknowledge, predestination of the just, and efficacious grace appear to leave no room for human freedom or responsibility. They appear to entail fatalism instead. They also appear arbitrary, thereby making it more difficult to reconcile belief in God's providence and goodness with the widespread evil, injustice, and suffering that exists in the world. Much of the debate on these issues between Catholics and Protestants, Jansenists and Jesuits, followers of Banyas or Molina, has been informed by St. Augustine's anti-Pelagian teachings. However, these are not just problems with which theologians grapple. They shape our understanding of the spiritual life and cooperation with divine grace. In this interview, Taylor Patrick O'Neill discusses predestination and some of the best books in it. Dr. Taylor Patrick O'Neill is a professor at Thomas Aquinas College. He is the editor of She Orders All Things Sweetly, Sacra Doctrina, and the Sapiential Unity of Theology, published by Cluny Media, and author of Grace, Predestination, and the Permission of Sin, Atomistic Analysis, published by Catholic University of America Press. The books discussed in this episode are, first, The Predestination of the Saints and On the Gift of Final Perseverance by St. Augustine. Second, Summa Theologiae, first part, question 23, by St. Thomas Aquinas. Third, On Divine Foreknowledge, part 4 of Concordia, by Luis de Molina. Fourth, Predestination, by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Fifth, The Reality of God and the Problem of Evil, by Brian Davies. Sixth, Into Your Hands, Father, Abandoning Ourselves to the God Who Loves Us, by Father Wilfred Stenison. And seventh, Revelations of Divine Love, by Julian of Norwich. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode and also on the website. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Dr. Taylor Patrick O'Neill, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Is predestination a biblical doctrine?
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is why St. Augustine is so important. I think before St. Augustine, you certainly have other church fathers talking about things like predestination, certainly the importance of grace. But it's really, especially during the Pelagian controversy and St. Augustine attempting to respond to the Pelagian controversy, that you get a kind of, at least Augustinian reading of Scripture, and especially St. Paul. And St. Augustine pulling out of St. Paul all of these great lines, which talk about, in some way, some notion of predestination, some notion of election or calling. And it's really those particular lines in Scripture which become the kind of foundation and the backbone for St. Augustine's own, well, first of all, his condemnation of Pelagianism, and then second of all, his own doctrine of predestination, foreknowledge, providence, etc.
There's been an ongoing debate over predestination since at least the 5th century. What are the main phases or stages of this debate?
Yeah, so I think it has been one of the main areas in which there have been, not only have there been theological writings that have been done, but I do think it's one of those main areas in theology where there have been sort of church, I don't want to say conflicts, but disagreements among theologians, among church fathers, among even doctors of the church. So it's a tricky area, right? There's some areas in theology which there's a lot written about them, and in general, there's more sort of agreement than disagreement. And this is an area where there's been a lot of disagreement, and so sometimes it can be hard to parse out exactly what the church has taught, what the church has not taught. But I would say that generally the historical trend, I think, is the first major moment, at least that I would argue, is the moment that I was just referencing. So St. Augustine and Pelagius. And that kind of creates an ongoing debate over the next few hundred years. You have theologians like St. Prosper of Aquitaine, who is kind of a disciple of St. Augustine, writing almost exclusively, not entirely, but quite a bit on this topic, and writing against some other theologians within the church. And then I think that the next sort of major moment is what's known as the De Auxiliis controversy. So this is very shortly after the Council of Trent. So I would sort of lump the whole Reformation theology, especially right, Calvin and Luther, they have very much their own doctrine of grace, their own doctrine of election and predestination. And that causes not only the church to respond to them and to their thoughts, but it also causes the church to do some sort of soul searching within, if you will. And so it reignites this debate. And so shortly after the Council of Trent, you have the De Auxiliis controversy, and a whole congregation is set up. In this case, you have primarily Dominicans who are arguing for sort of Thomistic, what comes to be known as a Banyezian position on predestination. And then you have primarily the Jesuits arguing for what comes to be known as a Molinist, and then later a congruist definition of predestination. But that's really a huge debate. And so that goes on for a period of time. And then I would say a smaller maybe moment in the last, say, 100 years. There was certainly a debate within the Thomistic body of theologians, arguing about whether the sort of traditional Augustinian Thomistic position is sufficiently different from Jansenism. And so I take that as kind of the tail end of a third large period, which was the church dealing with things like Jansenism, sort of a latent or quasi-Calvinism within the church. So for me, I would say label those as maybe the three major moments.
What are the main magisterial pronouncements on predestination?
Yeah, so this is something I was alluding to earlier. I mean, in a way, it's a little tricky because there's maybe not as much as we would like there to be. So I do think that there's a few sort of major moments. There's certainly the Council of Trent, I think, is the touchstone, because at the Council of Trent, the church is attempting to respond to particular theologies about grace, free will, justification, and predestination. And by condemning some of the errors of Luther and Calvin, we get, at least by way of negation, a kind of minimum, right? So this is what the church holds, and then the church doesn't define anything beyond that. So I do think it's the case that drawing primarily from the Council of Trent and other sort of smaller councils that are nonetheless quoted at Trent, for example, the Council of Orange, which is shortly after the time of St. Augustine, I would say that there's sort of maybe a handful of particulars that the church does seem to teach definitively. Just as an example of a few, I think the church does teach that that election and predestination is ante praevisa merita. So in other words, God doesn't call or elect those who are saved based off a merely kind of passive foreseeing of what goods they will do. That rather, in some respect, and the devil's always in the details, right? But in some respect, God is actively causal of the good that we do. So not passively just foreseeing, but actively from all eternity causing the good that we do. I also think that one of the another principle that's essential that all Catholics hold is that God does not command the impossible. So this is something that we know by way of negation, because the Council of Trent condemns Calvin for saying that for some people, the good to which the law calls them is actually just impossible for them because they're reprobate or they don't receive the grace that's necessary to do it. And instead, the Church says, no, it would be unfair to punish someone who doesn't have the ability to do the good. And so it's always the case that we have the ability to do the good that we're called to do. So those would just be some examples, I think, of some of the things that the Church has clearly and definitively taught. But I do think that exactly which position on predestination is correct is not something that the Church has necessarily stated explicitly de fide.
What is the key to understanding divine predestination aright?
Yeah, so there, I really think that starting with Scripture is essential. So St. Augustine really draws a lot on a couple of passages from St. Paul, and I think that's where we would need to start. So St. Paul rhetorically asks the question, what do you have that you have not received? And it's asked rhetorically, but I think St. Paul's, his clear answer is that there's nothing that we have that we haven't received. And so all of the good that we have is coming primarily and fully from God. And the reason for that is that God is the good, right? So there's a single source of goodness. And so all the good that we have, the good of our actions, the good of having a right-ordered intellect or will, these are all things that are only there by participation. And so they're only there because in some way they are a gift of God. And so I think starting there is essential, recognizing that grace is both gratuitous, so it comes first from God and not on account of something that we have done to necessarily force God to give it to us. And then second of all, that all the good that we have is in some way the result of God moving us, either via grace or by some natural motion. And so what that does is it really puts the primacy of God in its proper place. And so we come to recognize that we are radically contingent upon God for all of the good that we have. And to whatever extent that we talk about merit, and we do talk about meritorious acts and meriting the beatific vision in some sense, but even all of that is a gift from God. St. Augustine says, merit is grace for grace. So God's already given us grace to do the good, and then on account of that, we do the good, and then because we've done the good, God gives us even more grace. So I think that primacy of God and the divine will and the divine love to give us grace, not because God owes it to us in justice, but really just as an act of love, I think that's an essential place to start with predestination. And that sort of quickly gets us into difficult questions. But this notion that we don't sort of force God to give us grace is essential. And then I think the second thing that I would mention is that we tend to think of the divine will and the human will as competitive, so that to whatever extent God is doing something, that means that he's not leaving room for me to act freely. And I think that the tradition has done has spent a lot of time showing and trying to explain exactly how it is the case that God can sort of cause me to do something, and he can cause me to do something even in a way that's infallible. So I will definitely do what God wills me to do, but yet it's still completely free. It's coming about in a completely human and contingent mode, so that when I look at Scripture, when I look at the theological tradition and see all of this great stuff, going all the way back to Boethius or whomever, about God's exhaustive providence, God ruling and guiding over all things, God ordering all things to the good, I see that as not excluding human free action, but as incorporating human free action even into God's ordering.
Is there a difference between the Catholic and Orthodox churches on the doctrine of predestination?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm certainly not an expert on Orthodox theology. It does seem to me that there are differences, at least within pockets of Orthodoxy. So, for example, there certainly has been, I think, a little bit more of a openness to the doctrine of universalism among some Eastern theologians and traditions. Whereas I think in the West,
explain what you mean by universalism.
Yeah, so just this notion that all souls are saved, either all human beings at the very least, or maybe all human beings and all fallen angels, etc. I do think in the West we have, I don't know if it's more just sort of in the imagination, because we have things like Dante, we have things like John Milton, etc. But we certainly speak about hell, I think, a little bit more. And so the notion that no, there is some kind of hell, there's some kind of damnation, is maybe something that we're grappling with a little bit more. But I also know that for many of the Orthodox, the reality of hell is taken as a given as well. And so, yeah, I don't want to say too much more than that. I think that for the most part, a lot of the debates and controversies over predestination and infallible grace and providence that happen in the West, there are very similar debates that are tracking in the East, even if they're not always using the same sort of Thomistic or scholastic language.
But some would contrast the Orthodox Church's emphasis on the synergy between God and man in the process of divinization with the Catholic teaching on grace. Does the Catholic Church also share this view of the cooperation between God and man?
Yeah, I think absolutely it does. But again, it really depends upon what we mean by cooperation. So, as I was just stressing earlier, certainly the Augustinian Thomistic tradition within the Western Church emphasizes cooperation of man with God. But when we talk about cooperation, we could think about cooperation in two different ways. A lot of the Thomistic theologians will distinguish between what they call subordinated cooperation and coordinated operation. So coordinated operation is something like two causes that are working together, but without one cause being contingent upon the other. So a kind of classic example of this is two people lifting a couch or something. If two people are lifting a couch, both people are roughly doing about 50% of the work, right? And my lifting this end of the couch is pretty much independent from the other person lifting their end of the couch. So, if I were to drop my end of the couch, the other person would still be holding theirs up. So in that sense, you've got two causes that are kind of working together, but on the same level of causality. And in the Augustinian Thomistic tradition, instead of that notion of cooperation, there's this notion of subordinated cooperation. And so what that means is it's still true that God and man are working together, and each one of them is doing something within their own order to bring about the good act in an individual, but that the causality of man is contingent upon the causality of God. So they're subordinated. They're on two different levels rather than sharing on the same level. So a kind of classic example of this would be like an instrumental cause. So if I'm writing on a blackboard, then in one sense I'm the cause, and in another sense the chalk or the marker is the cause. But because we're operating on two different levels, you wouldn't say that I'm 50% the cause and the marker is 50% the cause. I think we would say that they're both 100% the cause, though in different ways or in different orders. And so that's the notion there. So this idea that we do act, and we are the ones who perform a good deed or perform a meritorious act. And so in that sense, we are co-causal with God in bringing about the good act. But our causality, instead of cooperating with God on the same level, is something that is itself the effect of God moving us to cause some good act. And so our causality is contingent upon God in a way that two people lifting a couch, their causality is not contingent upon each other. And the reason why that's really important, I would argue, is that we don't want to think, although we do talk about cooperation, we don't want to think about us working back and forth with God as if God were just another creature, as if he were not sort of sovereign and overseeing what we're doing, but instead we're just another actor that we are pushing back against, and then he's pushing back against us, and we're in a kind of a back and forth relation with God. Because God is immutable, God is unchangeable, and so creatures don't work back and forth with God in exactly that manner. Although I would say certainly, yes, cooperation, absolutely, because we are co-causal with God.
The Protestant reformers often appeal to the authority of St. Augustine. What is the difference then between the Catholic doctrine of predestination and that of Reformed Christianity?
Yeah, this is an excellent question and a really big one. I would say that there's primarily two things that differentiate what I would say is the kind of Catholic interpretation of St. Augustine. Certainly, at least implicitly, Trent's interpretation of St. Augustine from that of, say, John Calvin. The first thing that I would say is that the Church rejects the notion of a kind of positive reprobation. So Calvin had this notion that God not only sort of leaves certain individuals to their own sinfulness or permits them to continue in their sinfulness, but that God actively, causally moves certain human beings to mortal sin. So God is causing them to engage in mortal sin. That is rejected. Relatedly, the other thing that I would say is condemned is the notion that for Calvin, God does not in any way desire the salvation of all men. So for Calvin, God positively wills against some men being saved, therefore causes them to make themselves not saved, and thereby actually makes it impossible for human beings that are not saved to do the good that they're commanded to do. So I mentioned this earlier. Trent is very clear that we cannot say that the good that we ought to do is impossible to us. But Calvin just says, no, absolutely, it is impossible. If you are a reprobate, it's impossible for you to follow the commandments. And so, the issue there, of course, is that you have God intimately involved as co-cause with sin.
The Catechism of the Catholic Church condemns this sort of double predestination and teaches that God predestines no one to go to hell. For this, a willful turning away from God, a mortal sin is necessary and persistence in it until the end. That's number 1037. However, many wrongly assume that according to the doctrine of predestination, as you just pointed out, God decides who ends up in hell and who ends up in heaven. Do these misconceptions circulate among Catholics because of superficial, incomplete catechesis on these issues?
Yeah. So, it's another very good question. I think this is so tricky. So, on the one hand, I do want to say, at the risk of sounding scandalous, at least at the outset, that for the Catholic tradition, there's a way in which it's quite true to say that God sort of decides, if you will, who goes to heaven. So the notion that God has predestined certain individuals before the foreseeing of their merits includes, in some respect, this notion that God is choosing gratuitously out of his love to give give to some a gift that is not owed to any human beings, which is not only to save them from the rebellion that they are in against God and to turn themselves away, if you will, from themselves, but even beyond that, not just to sort of put us back at the level of Eden, but to elevate us all the way, as he does with the saints, to elevate them all the way to participation in the divine life. That's a radical gift that is disproportionate in a certain respect to human nature. So in other words, not only is God not bound to save those who have freely chosen to be in rebellion against him, but God is even less bound to give them a gift that is infinitely beyond their nature, which is participation not in human good and human happiness, but participation in communion in divine good, divine life. So that's a kind of difficult and tricky thing at first, to say that that God does choose, if you will, some individuals to whom he gives that gift. But what that doesn't mean is that God is choosing those individuals and just sort of forcing them, if you will, into heaven. It also doesn't mean that God is just choosing arbitrarily. And this is a tricky thing for St. Augustine, for St. Thomas, when they're asked the question, why are some predestined and some not? Their answer is always, well, the divine wisdom is inscrutable. There may be some ratio, some reason, but it's beyond what men can conceive why God does things like that. And you get this in the book of Job, right? Things, where were you when I was planning everything out? You don't know. You don't see the whole picture. So that's one thing. The other thing is that doesn't mean that God is sort of actively foreordaining or predestining those who are not saved to hell. As we just mentioned, Calvin certainly seems to argue that in many places, and the church explicitly condemns this. It's not just sort of imprudent or whatever to hold that God causes sin. It's actually an impossibility for God to cause the sinfulness of sin. And so on that account, we say that it's impossible that God could move people to reprobation, to damnation, in the same way that he moves the saints, that he moves Christians forward in the Christian life. And so that's a really tricky thing to see. It seems like, well, if Catholics do believe in some sense of predestination, then it must mean that reprobation works kind of like how Calvin sees things. So I think the difficult thing there is, I wouldn't even put that on the back of catechesis. I just think some of it's the difficulty of this theological doctrine. And it's not a theological doctrine that we tend to talk a lot about. I mean, you don't hear a lot of homilies about election or predestination. And maybe for good reason, I don't know. I do think that one of the difficulties is that, I guess my own opinion is that catechesis, if anything, tends toward a kind of maybe semi-Pelagianism. So I think that we tend to think about grace and free will as if God is kind of passive to our will, that God is maybe intervening in creation at certain times, but for the most part, and especially in relation to human actions, he has to be sort of passive and hands-off. Because the notion that God could order not just sort of irrational events outside of the human will, but the idea that God could even order the rational movements of the human will seems anathema. It seems like, well, that then robs us of our freedom. And so that means that we have to hold that although God sort of presents us with grace, it's ultimately up to us whether or not we accept it. So I always think when I tell my students when we're talking about this, I think of that sort of classic image of Jesus knocking on the door, which is a fine image, but it can imply that that's what grace is, that Jesus is sort of going around and knocking on each person's door, but then it's sort of up to the individual, apart from grace, whether they open the door, whether they accept Christ, or whether they leave Christ out in the cold, as if that were something that grace were not also intimately involved with. And not just sort of giving us the occasion to do, But when we answer, when we convert, when we do what's good, it is in some respect God causing us not just to have the opportunity, but God actually causing us to do that good deed, God causing us to convert. Those, I think, are essential elements that sometimes catechesis does lose.
The devotions to the Sacred Heart and Divine Mercy, corroborated by private revelations to saints and the subsequent incorporation into the liturgical year, were in part a reaction to the excessive rigorism and pessimism of Jansenism. Do these devotions indicate that you always need to think about predestination with the assurance that God calls us to repent and offers us his mercy and grace?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. At that time, Jansenism had become really a big problem, especially in certain areas in Europe. And so Jansenism is, in a way, kind of a highly Calvinistic understanding of Catholicism. And so, yeah, I think one of the issues with Jansenism is that it kind of falls into the same error, ironically, that Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism fall into, which is that if you think that God's providence is competitive with our freedom, then you can sort of fall into one of two directions. You can fall into the Pelagius side of things and think, well, because our free will is competitive with God's providence, that means that we need to either, when we want to really safeguard one, we've got to sort of dial down or turn down the other one. And so for Pelagius, he wanted to safeguard our freedom. And in a way, what Pelagius was attempting to, Pelagius is condemned rightly by the church for his ideas, but in a certain respect, I have some sympathy for Pelagius, because at least the error that he was trying to fix was a great moral and spiritual laxity among the people around him. So people just seemed to act like what they did didn't really matter, maybe a kind of presumption of salvation, whatever. And so what Pelagius was trying to do was say, no, what you do really matters. You can fall into grave sin. You can commit meritorious acts that move you toward heaven. So you need to really be very serious and disciplined in your moral life. But so for Pelagius, what he's trying to do then is he's trying to emphasize free will and the place that the part that we play in our salvation. And so what that meant, though, because he was starting from a place of competition, was he had to turn down or dial down in a certain respect, the place of the divine will, right? The exhaustibility of providence, the primacy of the divine will and of grace. So God gives us things. For Pelagius, God just sort of gives us free will and the kind of blueprint. So Christ's sort of salvific only in that he's a kind of exemplar for how we should act. But grace is not actually working interiorly to cause you to convert, to cause you to perform a good act. And what I would say the Jansenists were sort of unfortunately doing is taking that same error that human actions and divine actions are competitive, but they just placed the emphasis on the other dial, if you will. They thought, well, we've got to ensure that we talk about the primacy of God and the primacy of grace, and so we'll just turn down the dial on human freedom. And if that's true, they fell into what's known as quietism. Well, it doesn't really matter what I do that much. It's already predestined, etc. And I think what those devotions that you bring up were meant to do was to sort of bring us back to the proper and true mean, where we're recognizing sort of at 100%, the dials are turned all the way up, both on the primacy of God and the divine will, and on the human will. So as I was mentioning earlier, both of these things are 100% causal in bringing about the salvation of the saints. And so if you turn either one of them down, you've got a real problem. And so if we're thinking about predestination or the primacy of grace in such a way that we start to think that, well, what I do doesn't actually matter, then we're completely misunderstanding. We're misunderstanding what St. Augustine said. We're misunderstanding what St. Thomas Aquinas said. And so we've got to recognize that, yes, God is moving all things to the good, but that includes my actions. And my actions are being done in a human mode. And that means that I'm in charge of them. I have to do everything that I can to do the good. And when I can't do the good, do everything I can to pray to God to receive the strength to do the good that I feel I can't do in this moment.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.